Okay, what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at this treaty the Germans had to sign to end the war, the Treaty of Versailles. And we're going to think specifically about what the Germans thought of this treaty. Now, if you remember last time, the Germans, one of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles was that the Germans had to accept responsibility for causing the war, which wasn't necessarily true, and they had to pay reparations. Now, reparations are money and goods that are worth that amount of money they had to give to Britain, France, and the USA. And that was about 6.6 billion pounds that they had to pay. So it was a huge amount of money they had to pay as almost a punishment for losing the war, as they saw it. The treaty also said that Germany wasn't allowed to have any air force, submarines, um, and they could only have a tiny army and navy. The army was just about 100,000 men, which was a tiny compared to what it was before. And the navy, which had been getting bigger and bigger in the run up to the Second World War, was shrunk, and they couldn't have any submarines. Germany's colonies overseas, which they had in Africa and the Pacific Islands, had to be handed over. So they lost their colonies, they lost that land. The parts of the country were taken out to make new countries. So one example would be what we would have called then Czechoslovakia. But they had to give their land, a huge chunk of their land away to places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, as well as giving land to existing countries like France. And the last thing was a League of Nations set up. This was a big idea of Woodrow Wilson's, the American president, and it was this idea that instead of resorting to war, countries could have a League of Nations where they could talk about things and resolve their differences. It's similar to what we'd call today the United Nations, but that this is well before that existed. But Germany wasn't allowed to join this and wasn't allowed to benefit from being a member. Now, if we look here, last time you remember there were three main aims of the Treaty of Versailles. So some of the terms were intended to punish Germany and get revenge. So that would have been things like they had to lose their land, they had to lose their colonies. Some were meant to weaken Germany so it could never be a threat to them again. So that would be things like destroying the German Air Force, reducing the size of the army, because without a big army, Germany wouldn't be a threat. They couldn't attack the Allies again. And also to reward or compensate the Allies. And this is things like giving money to the Allies. So this £6.6 billion they had to pay as a punishment in reparations. Now, if you look here, you'll see there's a source here that kind of shows the German reaction. So in this area here, we've got the devil laughing over the Treaty of Versailles, gloating over it. Gloat over it means you're happy about it. You think this is great. And his friends or his cronies, which are like his accomplices, and they're called greed, revenge, and the lust for power. So this is giving that idea that this treaty um, is something really bad because the devil thinks it's great. So this was a sort of cartoon that was published in Germany to try and show how bad they thought the treaty was. Now the reactions were really negative. So we've got a source here. Today in the Hall of Mirrors, the disgraceful treaty is being signed. Do not forget it. The German people will regain their place amongst the nations to which they are entitled. Then will come vengeance for the shame of 1919. Vengeance is like revenge, like we'll get back at them for what they've done to us. Now, what that shows, this idea of vengeance was really important. What happened in Germany afterwards? A lot of historians think that the reason Hitler got into power was because they hated this treaty so much, and Hitler promised that if he was elected, he would throw it out, he would burn it. Now, at the time, there wasn't Hitler, but there were protests in the German Reichstag, which is the parliament, as well as on the streets. There's a number of reasons they were so angry and felt humiliated. Humiliated is they feel like they've been disgraced. They feel like humiliation is like it's all sometimes people say you're being made fun of, but this is humiliation is much worse. Now, if we look here, we can see we've got Article 231, which gives you an idea how big this was, hurt Germany's pride. Now, Article 231 was called the Guilt Clause, and Germany had to sign this document saying that the war and all the death, the millions of men who died, they had to sign a document saying it was all their fault. They didn't think they were all completely to blame. So surely Serbia, Austria-Hungary, Britain should share the blame, particularly if you think about it. Serbia assassinated Austro-Hungarian Archduke. That's what started all of this. So they see that as something other countries should have had the blame. They hated the fact that army was so small. They said they were helpless against other countries, and it was also unfair as other countries did not have to disarm as much. And they were unhappy about the loss of land. They claimed the treaty was an attempt to destroy their economy. Other nations were given self determination. That meant they had the right, a group of people had the right to be a nation. Example is Poland. So the Poles were allowed to self determine rather than being part of the German Empire, they could now be their own country with their own leaders speaking their own language. And that self determination means they got to decide what their future was. But the treaty meant Germans had to live in other countries. So one example would be the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia had lots of Germans living there. And they weren't allowed to say, hang on, we want to be part of our own country, we want to decide our own future in a country that speaks our language. They were forced to live in other countries. And we've got this thing here with Germany being squeezed by countries like America, France, Britain, and they're being squeezed, they're being told you've got to swallow this, whether you like it or not. And it says the big four pills. So this is they're being forced to accept this by the big four. And that's you can see there America, Britain, France, forcing them to accept this bitter pill. Now, Germans hated reparations because obviously it's a lot of money. They said France and Britain were trying to starve their children to death. But it was a diktat, which meant it was an imposed settlement. They had not been allowed to take part in the talks. They'd just been told they had to sign. So diktat means dictated. They were given the choice: sign this document with everything in it that you don't like, or we all get our guns out and we go back to war. And they couldn't go back to war. They couldn't afford to. They didn't have the men, so they had to sign it. So here's an example of this. A German cartoon that was published. You can see the little child skin, he looks like a skeleton, and the mother is saying to him, when we have paid the 100 billion marks, which was the German currency, then I'll be able to give you something to eat. So this was the idea that the Britain, France, and America were starving Germany. Now, in terms of the economy, I've already hinted this, the German economy was weakened by the treaty in several ways. Some examples are obviously they're forced to pay out large sums of money. So that's money that they don't have in their country, in their economy. They lost their colonies, and that meant they lost the money they made through their colonies, the money they made through trade with their colonies, and through the raw materials, the goods they were able to get from those colonies. They lost some of the lands lost included natural resources. So one example was the Saar, which was in the border with France, which had the majority of Germany's coal in it, was lost to them. The treaty said the Saar was to be controlled by Britain and France for 15 years. And after 15 years in 1935, the people in the Saar would get the choice of whether they wanted to be part of France, be part of Germany. In 1935, 90% of people decided to go back to Germany because they were German speakers. But at the time, for 15 years, they lost coal. And coal is really important because coal is what powers your factories. And your factories are what power your economy. It's how you make money. And if you don't have your own coal, you're going to have to buy that. And that's going to cost factories huge amounts of money. They're not making the profits which would go into the German economy. And the last thing was by reducing the size of armed forces. So if you worked in the Air Force, you lost your job. Many More than half the Navy lost their job, and more than half the Army lost their job. So this was a huge problem because it meant mass unemployment, less money in the country. Now, one of the questions I want you in your notebook, firstly, to talk about why Germany hated the treaty so much and give 4 specific reasons. So that means not just they didn't like having to pay money, tell me how much money they had to pay. Tell me why they didn't like that. And then next question is, which one do you think made them most angry and why do you think that? And then what you're going to have a look at is you're going to have a look at this source. So what I want you to do is with this source, to start off work out who do you think these 3 men are and who do you think this person is standing in front of the guillotine to get their head chopped off to be killed with their hands tied behind their back. Each one of these men represents a leader and this represents a country. Who do you think they are? And then I want you to analyze the source. And these are the things I want you to look at. Content, what's in the source, what's it showing. So this would be when you think about who each of these people are, what's happening to this person, what does that symbolize? Then provenance, who created this source and when, which you'll find down underneath the source. Message, what does the source tell you? What is the person, why, not why, what is the person trying to tell you with this cartoon? What point are they trying to make? Then purpose of the source. So think about, why was the source made? Does that alter the message? Reliability, how reliable is it? Can you trust it fully? And useful, how useful is this source at telling you about how the treaty was received? So does this source teach you anything about the German reaction to this treaty?